back to the Literary Bros podcast. Today, we're going to connect literature with modern culture. So we got me, Mason, Ross, and Dylan. And today, we're going to discuss Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer and asking a question that feels especially relevant to today's society. In a world built around followers, content, and public image, what does it really mean to live authentically? Chris McCandless walked away from money, family expectations, and society itself in search of something real. But if he lived today, would he still reject society, or would he just delete social media? That's the question we ask today.
After graduating college, he gives away all his savings, leaves behind almost all of his possessions, and even changes his name to his Alex alias that you see used all throughout the novel. That new name kind of is a symbol for Chris's internal struggle, kind of showing him trying to reinvent himself and disconnect himself from his old identity that everyone else knew him as. One of his more famous lines that you see used throughout the world that really kind of encapsulates his journey is when he was leaving and kind of throwing everything away, he wrote in his journal, "I now walk into the wild," which it kind of feels powerful because it represents his freedom, but also his uncertainty about not really knowing where his path is going to lead him. And he is literally walking into nature, but emotionally he's kind of freeing himself from society and everything that he was supposed to be in his life.
So in a way, Chris isn't just escaping physical places, he's escaping expectations.
Exactly. He rejects the idea that success equals money or comfort or status.
That connects really well to modern culture. Today, people aren't necessarily chasing wilderness, but they're chasing attention. What do you think that looks like now?
Highlights, achievements, vacations, relationships, basically a carefully edited version of their own life. According to the U.S. Surgeon General, teens who spend more time than 3 hours a day on social media may face increased mental health risks. That's interesting because Chris seems like the complete opposite of that lifestyle. He wasn't trying to be seen, he was trying to disappear.
That's a crazy contrast. So instead of asking, who am I really? People today sometimes ask, how am I being seen?
Indubitably, Chris searched for identity internally. Social media can push people to search externally.
Back to the book. What changes in Chris over time?
At first, Chris seems confident, kind of, and even a little rebellious, obviously, because he's kind of throwing everything away. And he kind of thinks independence is everything, kind of like Henry David Thoreau would say.
It really does, yeah.
The self-dependence. Near the end of his journey, he writes something that changes kind of the whole meaning of the story. Like, as the story develops, he becomes a lot more reflective. And he says, happiness is only real when shared towards the end, which kind of completely shifts the understanding of everything he was doing and like what he kind of learned throughout the book. Because he spent so much time and like so much of the story trying to escape people, but kind of in the end he realizes that complete isolation doesn't really lead to fulfillment automatically.
So the story almost like challenges his original philosophy?
Exactly. It suggests that like independence matters, but human connection matters too.
Now, it's time for the debate. Was Chris brave or reckless soul?
That's where the story really becomes controversial. Some readers admire Chris because he had the courage to reflect a life that felt fake, but others argue he was dangerously unprepared. He entered Alaska without enough supplies, training, or experience. So yes, his ideals were powerful, but I don't know if he was like necessarily prepared enough for it. His choices had serious consequences.
So maybe authenticity without wisdom is a dangerous culmination of factors leading to somebody's demise.
Some would say, and I also think that connects to modern culture too. Many influencers promote society that look free and authentic, but sometimes when it's like inspiring online, it's not necessarily the reality.
So what does the psyche of the mind say about all this?
The American Psychological Association has discussed how constant digital comparison can affect confidence, stress, and self-image. That matters because Chris wasn't comparing himself to anyone. He stepped away from competition. In some ways, his journey represents what happens when someone tries to discover their identity without outside noise.
That really is something a lot of people today probably struggle with.
For sure. Yeah. Phones, notifications, trends, and algorithms, it's hard to hear your own thoughts through all the noise.
This, if he breathed and lived in society today, do you really think he would make the same choices of giving up his life and going to the Alaska wilderness?
I think he would still probably reject modern society but maybe his wilderness would look a little different than it did back then. Maybe it wouldn't be Alaska, maybe it would just be unplugging.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the real lesson. You don't have to disappear completely to live authentically. But maybe you need moments away from the noise to kind of like recapture yourself.
Earlier, we talked about Chris rejecting society, but there's another layer to this idea of authenticity that we haven't fully explored yet. Because Chris wasn't the first person to really think like this. He really is part of a really much older philosophical tradition.
One major influence that connects to Chris McCandless is Henry David Thoreau, like I stated earlier. And he wrote Walden, which is one of the books that McCandless really speaks a lot about throughout the novel. Thoreau also left society to live simply in nature, arguing that people are too distracted by the material life to kind of really focus on what actually matters. But there is an important difference between the two. Thoreau lived near society and documented his experience with reflection and structure. And Chris, on the other hand, kind of went a lot further than what Thoreau was doing and completely cut himself off from communication, no maps, and kind of no way out, no safety net per se. So while Thoreau was kind of experimenting his simple escape from daily life, Chris was just kind of going after a total isolation.
So it really is like Chris took a philosophical idea and twisted it and bended it to push it to its extreme limits in the real world.
Exactly. That's what makes his story so powerful and kind of so debated and controversial. He wasn't just rejecting comfort, he was rejecting pretty much any system that could have supported him at all.
And when we connect that to today, we see a different version of the same desire. Instead of going into the wilderness, people will often try to escape digitally or on social media. For example, some people will try to delete apps, they'll try to get rid of phones, social media, anything that connects them, or they'll call it digital detoxes. But even those breaks are temporary, people end up even going back to them. Modern life is built around constant connection and stimulation, so it's really hard for people to just throw away their social media life and run away from the reality. Notifications, algorithms make it really hard for people to get away from that kind of thing.
Yeah, dopamine is the drug of the new age. Dopamine, people say, if you exploit that in the mind, it's more addictive than heroin. So really, instead of physical isolation of both the mind and body, like Chris, are people today really just dealing with a mental overload?
Right, and in a way, Chris's journey highlights something that people still feel today, the need to step away from the noise and to think clearly. But the difference is sustainability. Chris tried to remove the noise completely, and most people today can only reduce it for a short amount of time.
There's also another angle that we should consider is romanticizing nature. Chris's story has inspired a lot of people, but it's also important to kind of remember the reality of the world. Wilderness is not just peaceful, it's unpredictable and dangerous. Survival requires preparation, knowledge, and a respect of the environment. So when people kind of view Chris as a symbol of freedom, a lot of the times they can overlook what the risks that kind of come with all his choices are.
It kind of becomes a twisted balance between inspiration and caution.
Precisely. It's a story both about searching for meaning and warning, but also idealism without preparation.
And that tension is kind of what makes Into the Wild so relevant today. Because even now, people are constantly trying to define what a real life looks like. For some, it's success and stability. And then for others, it's freedom and escape. But Chris's story suggests that neither extreme kind of fully works on its own. You have to find your happy medium.
I think that all kind of connects back to identity. If identity is only built on isolation, it can become really fragile. But if it's built on external validation like likes and comments, it can feel really empty. So the challenge is finding a balance between the isolation and the satisfaction from the reality.
That idea sets up our final question to a T. What does it actually look like to live authentically in a world that constantly pulls both the body and mind in opposite directions? And that is what I need you to think. In conclusion, I would say in the novella Into the Wild, Chris McCandless really challenges all of humankind to really question the success, identity, and what really makes life as a whole meaningful. And, you know, as we said, in a world full of followers, filters, influencers, and everybody worrying about themselves and nobody else, it asks one timeless question. Are we really living for ourselves or performing for the rest of humankind? Thanks for listening.
All right, we're
That's-
the Literary
Catch
Bros.
you next time.
Thank you so much for listening. Peace.